Hey there, Marketplace of Ideas podcast listeners. How's it going? 2011 is upon us, and you know what that means. It's the year in which we'll need to reach 10,000 podcast subscribers in order to continue. You can help by reviewing the show on iTunes. Go onto the iTunes store, search for the Marketplace of Ideas. There you'll find the page for the show where you can download it, but you can also give it a star rating and a review, thereby increasing its profile, getting us a little bit closer to 10,000. And of course, even better, tell a friend about the show. That's 10,000 in 2011, thus making me some sort of public radio superstar. I don't know the full plan, but thanks. This week, it's a conversation with Nathan Rabin, head writer at the AV Club and author of My Year of Flops, One Man's Journey into the Heart of Cinematic Failure, on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation at the depth you demand. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall, your man of letters and sound waves, talking today to Nathan Rabin, the head writer at the AV Club, the arts and culture magazine I'm sure you've already read online, that originally sprung from the loins of the satirical newspaper The Onion. And for 3 years there, he's been engaged in what he's called My Year of Flops, where he's covered movies that have flopped, revisiting box office failures. And it's now in book form, My Year of Flops, One Man's Journey Deep into the Heart of Cinematic Failure. Nathan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
We can say that these movies all have in common that they didn't do so well at the box office. I mean, that's what makes them flops. But what else do they have in common? Do these movies have anything in common that you can detect other than that people didn't buy a lot of tickets?
Well, from my criteria that I had to map out for this series, film had to meet one of three criteria, I guess. Wait, that's very redundant. First, they had to be commercial failures, one of which the other was they had to be critical failures. The third was they had to not have a cult following. And I chose a very, very eclectic range of films. This is probably the only book on the market that has a 4,000-word essay about the difficulties adapting Nabokov, and a 4,000-word essay about the film career of Andrew Dice Clay. I like to think of those as being kind of the two poles from which I operate. So I tried to cover a very, very broad spectrum of stuff. And one thing that I've noticed that you see a lot of sort of historic, monumental, catastrophic failures is this sort of crazy ambition and this crazy audacity and this desire to make something legitimately great that just flies sort of surreally off the rails. And those are the kind of films that I really kind of wanted to pay homage to in My Year of Flops. And less, sort of tacky little movies that don't really aspire to anything and come up short even in that respect.
And this will be familiar to anybody who's been following My Year of Flops on the AV Club site, because you have the rubric where things are successes or secret successes, failures, or fiascos. And this is kind of the domain of the fiasco you're talking about, right? Like the super ambitious movies that don't necessarily fall apart, but go in a lot of directions. Maybe
totally.
Nobody wanted to.
And a lot of them do legitimately fall apart and go in some crazy directions. When I think of like a quintessential fiasco, I think of something like Southland Tales, where, good God, that Richard Kelly knew what he was doing with Donnie Darko, and then his vision got bigger and bigger and bigger until it was just completely incoherent. But at the same time, there are like all these sequences in Southland Tales. There's like a 5-minute standalone sequence of Justin Timberlake bleeding from the head, staring straight into the camera, and singing along to a Killers song.
Yes.
That you're never going to find in any other movie or anywhere else for that matter. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, I like calling people by their nicknames. He plays, sort of this incredibly paranoid, sort of out of it action star who might hold the key to saving the universe. So Southland Tales is, again, kind of a sort of crazy disaster that I find infinitely more compelling than, say, most of the films that win Best Picture Academy Awards. I'd much rather see Southland Tales a dozen times than watch A Beautiful Mind again.
Southland Tales is a good case study here because I don't know, you'll be more informed about this than I will, but do you consider it to be a flop that flopped because things didn't really work out in production, or a flop that flopped because it really was what Richard Kelly wanted down to the last detail?
Well, you make a good point. I think part of it was Richard Kelly. Sort of when Donnie Darko came out, and I believe 2001, it kind of flew under the radar. Drew Barrymore had produced it. It didn't do very well. It didn't get terribly great critical reviews. And then it became not only a cult film, but sort of a phenomenon. It became one of sort of the defining films of the decade. And Richard Kelly, I think when he made Donnie Darko, was still a very young man. I think he was in his mid-20s at most. So I think, when the world is telling you that you're the next David Lynch, it's kind of easy to see how you could kind of dream big. And he had this incredibly huge vision for Southland Tales, where there were, I think, 3 or 4 graphic novel prequels. So in order to sort of fully inhabit and understand the world that Richard Kelly had created, you had to go and spend $60 on graphic novels and read them all, and then you'd come to the theater and they'd be like, oh, that's Santos, and blah, 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 blah. And then also the original cut of Southland Tales was 3 hours long. So they screened the 3 hour long cut in Cannes, and it died. It was just eviscerated. And I think he kind of lost confidence to a certain extent in his vision. He cut off about 40 minutes, sort of the graphic novels which were supposed to fuel this huge interest in Southland Tales. They were supposed to make it this cultural happening. They just kind of died. Nobody really purchased them. So he had basically this entire world, this entire universe that he was super eager for people to explore and to experience, and it all pretty much went kaput before the film was even released. I mean, it was basically dead on arrival. And I think that happens a lot of times where a very, very ambitious, a very anticipated film will screen at a film festival. I guess Elizabethtown would be another good example. And they're like, oh my God, what a disaster you made. And, by the time you cut off 40 minutes, you're already kind of, walking wounded. You're already kind of a film that, whose possibilities have been constrained to a great deal. So I think that was basically it. He had this incredible vision for it, and the rest of the world was like, not so much.
Since we're going down this line, I can address this question that your book has made me think of, and of course following the entries before the book on the AV Club has made me think of, which is, I want to know how much delusions of grandeur on the part of a director or any kind of filmmaker contribute to floppiness. I mean, I think of Waterworld, that you give a pretty full treatment in the book. I think of Heaven's Gate. Michael Cimino, by all accounts, was going pretty far off his rocker during that production. Do you think that just a distorted self-image is a common driver of floppage, or what?
I would say distorted self-image and delusions of grandeur are a common factor in every Hollywood film that is ever made. And I think, again, something that you see, again, is that the things that kind of fuel masterpieces are the same things that fuel these giant fiascos. Sort of Michael Cimino, he had this huge vision for this very ambitious, 3-hour-long epic based on really non-commercial subject matter, and people thought he was crazy and that he'd gone too far. But then, they released The Deer Hunter, and it was, a phenomenon. It won Best Picture, it won Christopher Walken the Academy Award, and then he took the same sort of ambition, the same sort of incredible chances creatively, and it created Heaven's Gate. Sort of a similar thing with Roberto Benigni, where he took crazy chances to make Life is Beautiful and became this international icon. And then he took the same ridiculous chances and made Pinocchio. And the rest of the world was like, you were cute before. We're not really into you these days. So I think, when the world is telling you that you are a genius and that you're on the verge of making your masterpiece, that's an appetite, it's a recipe, rather, for greatness, and it's also a recipe for great folly.
And with the whole My Year of Flops project, what's fascinating to me is that people sometimes read it, and I'm sure you've seen this reaction happen. They read it as your journey through the realm of bad movies, but it's not exactly that. These movies are not necessarily bad. Of course, there are the secret successes of the bunch, but is that something you had to sort of straighten out in your mind, like a way to convey this project is not being yet another sort of, there's a lot of books about bad movies and, why to love bad movies. Certainly there are reasons for that. But this one, you had to clarify that this is just about movies movies that people didn't like, not necessarily bad, right?
Oh, totally. One big part of the reason why I started this project was because I felt like there was this tendency in our culture to associate commercial failure with sort of creative bankruptcy, with utter worthlessness. If something fails, that must mean that it's terrible, and I wanted to fight that. I wanted to say, well, there are a number of different reasons why things aren't successful, and sometimes the greatest art isn't successful the first time around. And, I didn't want to highlight, like Disney's Pinocchio, which was a huge, huge flop when it came out, but now is, universally recognized as this incredible masterpiece. And what I wanted to do with this was I wanted to sort of evangelize on behalf of these films that I felt like were misunderstood or cast aside, or the victim of timing, or the victim of hubris or bad press, or something of that nature. And I feel like that's kind of what I've spent my entire career sort of doing. I kind of got to this point about 4 years ago when I decided, I want to kind of make my life's work kind of defending things that people just kind of dismiss out of hand. Defending the indefensible, I guess, has kind of become sort of my niche. I've been writing a column about country music that's been pretty fascinating and incredibly unpopular. I've been writing about, the Now That's What I Call Music series, which pop music, not a lot of defenders, but, I'm trying to divine sort of the gems among pop pablum. And my next book actually is going to be about sort of bands that have these sort of very maligned fan bases. I started off with Fish, but it's kind of becoming as much about Insane Clown Posse at this point. And if you can defend the Insane Clown Posse and the Juggalos, who are, some of the most reviled creatures in popular culture, people tend to think of them as feral subhumans, then you can defend just about anything. I worry sometimes that, I'll stray a little too far along this path, and I'll kind of become, the William Kunstler of pop culture criticism, where I start off to, defending all the right people and full of idealism, and, I end up the pop culture equivalent of, representing terrorists and drug dealers and mobsters. Maybe that'll be my next incarnation. Is Nathan Rabin, pop culture liar.
Is that a danger in your mind that's sort of present strongly in your mind, that you think you might run the risk of crossing the line to where you're actually inflating things that are bad into seeming good because you like to defend things that are unfairly maligned?
Oh, definitely. I definitely think there's a danger of that. I tried to go into this project and kind of everything that I've been doing with a certain generosity of spirit. And I think that's a good thing. I feel like the older I get, I always want to err on the side of being nice. I kind of started this project to sort of fight this, snark, this sort of empty, sort of smug, reductive kind of pessimism and condescension. But you definitely can go a little too far. And I remember coming back from Hollow Wicked, the Insane Clown Posse's Halloween concert. I actually got into a bit of an argument with my girlfriend, and she's like, you don't want to recognize anything bad about these people. You just want to have this idealized, so romanticized version of them as like these suffering proletariats who really join together to this sense of solidarity and camaraderie. And yeah, it definitely can make your viewpoint myopic, almost in a different sort of way. Sort of myopic in a nice way as opposed to a mean sort of way. And actually, one of the things that I did to kind of see how the journey had changed me and altered the way that I saw the world was I began the book by writing about Elizabethtown, which was one of the primary inspirations for the series. And then the last entry is about Elizabethtown as well. And I don't want to give any spoilers here, but the first one is negative, and then the second one is positive, because I was able to see upon the third viewing sort of all of these things that I originally kind of snorted with disdain about actually seemed really kind of sweet and disarming and vulnerable the third time around. And it kind of won me over. And, maybe in, lobbyist parlance, I've gone native, but I don't necessarily know that's the worst thing in the world.
Now, for those who don't know, Elizabethtown is to this point the most recent movie by Cameron Crowe, director of Say Anything and Jerry Maguire and a bunch of movies, almost famous, very popular films. And you write about being a Cameron Crowe fan to an extent in the book. And this is interesting because he's a good figure for a book like this, because I do feel like Cameron Crowe has achieved success and achieved generally a good reputation. But I feel like underneath the skin, he has this sort of raging demon of badness that he's just keeping in check just barely, and he's somehow built his career on holding back this sort of badness beast underneath him. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I can totally see that, and I think Elizabethtown permanently changed the way I saw Cameron Crowe as a filmmaker, and I've noticed that if I'm flipping through channels and I watch, like a snippet of Say Anything or Jerry Maguire, I'm almost retroactively irritated by how big the writing is. And that's the thing about Cameron Crowe. He goes for it. He's never afraid to go for these like really big pop operatic moments, like these. They just basically scream for attention. Show me the money. You had me at hello. Like those easily could have been just incredibly, incredibly embarrassing moments in film. But he kind of straddles that very, very fine line. And then in Elizabethtown, you have the exact same kind of big, big moments, but this time they're, Orlando Bloom trying to kill himself by affixing steak knives to his exercise bike. Because apparently he wants to kill himself by, stabbing his own eyes out so that he bleeds to death on his exercise bike. Kind of the quintessential word I'm overusing in this interview. Well, one of the big moments in the film is Susan Sarandon's character, who is a widow whose husband has just died, kind of the catalyst for all the action in the movie. She decides to use her husband's memorial to launch her tap dancing and her stand-up comedy career. So she does an elaborate tap dance to Moon River, and then she, recites this very raunchy stand-up comedy routine to like all these, 75-year-old Southerners who are mourning, the loss of this, beloved figure.
Yes.
So again, I feel like what fuels Cameron Crowe to be a great filmmaker and to be earnest and sincere and to just have this incredible love and affection for his characters and these worlds that he creates are the same thing as I kind of led Elizabethtown to be kind of this squirmy, sad little puppy. And by the very end, I felt like I kind of had to adopt and embrace as my own.
The sincerity of Cameron Crowe and his lack of irony, the irony that's gotten so pervasive culturally but seems to be slowly ebbing away these days, that's something I can appreciate about him, even though his films haven't cracked my own top 10. But I mean, he's sincere, and that's worth something. And it's true for a lot of the filmmakers, it seems like, that you cover in My Year of Flops. There are no movies that were made ironically in this book, correct?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there are definitely films that were very kind of cynical commercial enterprises. Real Cancun and Bratz,
oh, yes.
The movie, I think there are two, where those were just basically made to make money. And they were also made by people who hate America and people who hate movie goers. And again, I feel like if those films were successful, Real Cancun was like the reality movie that MTV created as kind of a test balloon to see, can we, spend a week and a half showing teenagers like making out in South Beach and pretend that's a movie that people should spend $12 on. And to their credit, the American public said, "Oh God, no! What a horrible, horrible idea." And Bratz, the movie, was based on the line of like skanky dolls. And if those had been successful, like, good God, I'd probably be writing about, Bratz 4 or Bratz 5 at this point. So those were the kind of films where, there really wasn't nothing good. There were no good intentions behind them. And the bad intentions led to something that wasn't just bad, but kind of hateful and immoral. But those weren't the kind of films that I wanted to kind of highlight in this. I wanted to, pay tribute to films that take these chances and that, and in this world, it's taking a big chance to be sincere, to be non-ironic, to kind of put your heart out there. But again, it's kind of a bit of a delicate dance, because the last proper chapter in my book is a sort of very sweet, very earnest, very sincere appreciation of Elizabethtown and then Joe versus the Volcano, the John Patrick Shanley film with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. And I almost felt like, God, I can't go out on such a sweet, sincere, earnest note. Like, I have to, snark it up a little bit. So it ends with a sort of a minute-by-minute account of Waterworld, the director's cut, which is not overly sincere, is not overly generous in spirit.
It's true. I mean, this is maybe getting into semantics, but I do think of, yes, films like Joe versus the Volcano. There's a lot of sincerity to those movies, and Elizabethtown and Cameron Crowe's other films. But then I think of Kevin Costner's movies, and you as you say, you cover Waterworld in there, and I think his follow-up, The Postman, doesn't have any better reputation than Waterworld does. And perhaps you're right that those aren't necessarily sincere movies, but
actually, The Postman is an incredibly sincere movie, and I actually gave a positive review to The Postman in my the Meyer Flops series proper. And if you watch it now, it's this really, really insane film, in part because Waterworld was such a huge, huge failure, like 2 years before. So the hubris to be like, well, that post-apocalyptic, 3-hour-long epic, that's just a giant vanity project for me. Well, that failed. But this 3-hour-long post-apocalyptic epic that's just a vanity project for me is going to be hugely successful. But the thing that's crazy about The Postman, other than it got made in the first place, is it's basically a love letter to American bureaucracy and a love letter to the post office. And this idea that, in a world that has crumbled, where democracy no longer exists, where kind of anarchy thrives, that something as simple as delivering mail could give people hope, could renew this idea of like democracy and all of these ideals. And I'm actually a third generation postal officer, postman, whatever the hell that is. My dad and my grandfather were both a postman. So I think I was kind of, just by disposition, kind of inclined to like this movie. It's also very, very Capra-esque, which, again, is kind of a weird thing to say about a post-apocalyptic 3-hour-long movie starring Kevin Costner. But I feel like it's got a big heart, and its heart is in the right place. Even if, I'm very, very much in the minority and thinking that that's a good, sweet, sincere film.
Yes, I have to say I shouldn't apply the label insincere to any movie that ends with the whole Kevin Costner on the horse being cast into a bronze statue handing the letter to the kid. Is that how it ends? You probably remember better than me.
It's been a couple of years since I saw The Postman, but I did think it was, if the post office had given somebody $100 million to make a movie, I think it probably would have been The Postman.
Now, this idea of the sort of figures of floppiness, the Cameron Crowe of Elizabethtown we've discussed, Kevin Costner we've discussed, and he's very often held up as a joke figure of floppiness almost. Who else are the auteurs of floppiness in your mind?
Well, I think you got John Travolta. I believe, I think I put in the book that, he's so synonymous with cinematic failure that when other actors have films that don't do well, they actually have to pay him a royalty. He sort of pioneered that concept. And he's also this guy where nothing can kill his career. He's just made flop after flop after flop after flop. But he always, manages to find a way to come back. I mean, it's astonishing. It's either, this bond that he's formed with the public is impregnable. Nothing can stop it. Or he made this sort of Faustian bargain, and he still has a couple more years left on it. Yui Boll, I think, is kind of a fascinating figure who has become synonymous with floppiness. And also just how on earth can this guy make nothing but bombs and yet make 3 or 4 of them every year? And these are, again, I think, people who make the world a more interesting place. We did a inventory a little while ago. It's like a weekly list feature, and it was directors you didn't know you hated. And the idea was not to do somebody like Yui Boll, but Tom Shadyac, who directed Patch Adams and Bruce Almighty. And I think the Tom Shadyaks of the world make the world a little more mediocre, a little more predictable, a little more colorless. Whereas, the Yui Bolls and the John Travoltas of the world make it a weirder, more interesting, more electric, and more vibrant place. So I thank God for Yui Boll, and I thank God for John Travolta, in part because they'll always give me something to write about.
This is an important line to draw because I'm guessing, and that's a good idea for a list, I'm going to pull up that inventory as soon as we finish up here, but of the directors you didn't know you hated, because the directors you hate, quote unquote hate, they're not the ones who were doing bad. They're just the ones who were doing not kind of anything, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah, they're just making the world more generic. And every once in a while, like a very mediocre director can like come up with something that's sort of okay. God, that's some very, very fake praise. Thinking of Sean Levy, who is a not very accomplished filmmaker, but he directed Date Night, which again is not even that good of a film, but it's mildly amusing, just based solely sort of on the talent involved. So sometimes they kind of overachieve slightly. But yeah, I kind of feel like those are the sort of people you don't find in my year flops. I kind of want to go for, the crazy dreamers, the people who dream big.
How did you want to approach the challenge of writing about, the flops you knew you would have to write about, the flops, the movies that are synonymous with flopping, like as we've discussed, Waterworld, Battlefield Earth more recently, even Ishtar after that Far Side cartoon. I don't think that's ever going to leave the consciousness as what a flop is. I mean, that's kind of these are imposing towers of floppage to approach, right?
Yeah, I mean, they are. And there's certain stuff that, I am kind of a generalist. When I started writing for the AV Club, I was the third employee. So I basically had to do everything. I had to do, films and cover television for a very long time, but music, and I just had to have a very broad frame of reference for everything. But there are things that I feel a lot more qualified to write about than others. Hip-hop films, 50 Cent. Weird movies from the 1970s. I just wrote about pretty much all in a row. And there are certain things that I just don't feel that qualified to write about, one of which would be the movie Dune. Yes. I like science fiction. I'm a casual fan. I think being a casual fan of science fiction and fantasy is tantamount to not liking science fiction and fantasy in a lot of people's minds. Where again, I just didn't feel that qualified to write about it, and I didn't want to read, 700-page book that I probably would have given me a terrible, terrible headache, and wouldn't have made the film any more easier to process. So that was one that probably should have gone into the book, but I just felt like I had to be at my absolute best. I had to strive for. Let's see, it seems funny to say perfection. Just when I feel like my work is so messy a little bit, that hopefully makes it a little more alive. But yeah, I felt like I had to write about Dune, but I wasn't really that qualified to write about Dune. So the irony is that I wrote a piece that was good enough at best, and it got much, much, much more of a response than like any Meyer flop entry that I'd written about for months and months and months. It was because it was the movie that people were interested in, not so much on my take on it. And in a lot of ways, being online, you're kind of irrelevant. It's kind of, you're hosting a cocktail party and people sort of pair off and talk about what they want to talk about. And they don't particularly care about you, with your little tray of cocktail wieners, your little mimosas that you're handing out. So yeah, there were definitely films that I felt like I had to write about. But I also, tried to strike a neat balance between movies that I had to write about, like, for example, Cleopatra. Like, you can't write a book about flops and not have Cleopatra. You can't have a book about flops and not have The Last Action Hero or The Cable Guy. But I also wanted to highlight films that people didn't know existed. Like Skidoo would be a good example of that. Otto Preminger's Ultimate acid-soaked free love freak fest from 1968, starring Groucho Marx and Peter Lawford and Cesar Romero. And I don't know why, but Otto Preminger sort of felt like, how can I make the ultimate young people's movie and nobody in it will be younger than 70 years old? I also wrote about The Great Moment, which was Preston Sturges's solo dramatic film. And far and away the biggest flop he ever had. It was a film about the refinement of ether as a dental anesthetic in the 19th century, which sounds like the most boring subject matter in the world, and that's probably why it tanked at the box office, especially coming out in the middle of World War II. But it's actually like a really funny, very alive, very sad, and a very Preston Sturgesy film. Another that I didn't have to write about, but that, I found really fascinating was the musical version of I'll Do Anything. And I'll Do Anything was James L. Brooks. He was sort of a great writer-director. He's one of the main people behind The Simpsons, Mary Tyler Moore, just this legend, probably one of the richest, most powerful men in Hollywood, for the last 30 years. And he decided to write and direct a movie about people in Los Angeles who are overly in touch with their feelings, which is basically the subject of all of his films. But he decided, you know what, this is going to be a film of like this sort of intimate comedy drama about people's neuroses and their need for validation. But it's also going to be a musical with songs by Prince and choreography by Twyla Tharp. So it was this very strange sort of marriage of like very small, intimate drama, character-based drama. And then, people singing and dancing and hoofing up a storm. And what happened was they test screened the film. And one of the many ironies is that the film is basically about test screenings, about focus groups, and about how people in Hollywood can never get enough attention or validation or praise. And when they showed it to focus groups, they said, boy, we really hate all the songs. Can you cut out all of the songs? So James L. Brooks, who, again, at that point should have had sort of the courage of his convictions, could have said, like, I don't need the film to be successful. Like, I have all the money in the world. Like, this is my baby. I had a vision for it. Like, so what if people don't like it? I'm going to do it anyway. But no, instead he cut out every single song from his movie. And when something like that happens, by the time it hits theaters, people are like, yeah, kind of looking at it as a corpse, not as a going entity. So I actually got my hands on the musical version of I'll Do Anything. And I'm like, oh, God, I have to write about that.
If you've just tuned in, this is The Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Nathan Rabin, head writer at the AV Club and author of My Year of Flops, One Man's Journey into the Heart of Cinematic Failure. If you'd like to hear this show again after it's over, or any other interview in the Marketplace of Ideas history, visit colinmarshallradio.com, where you will find the complete Marketplace of Ideas archive. You can also listen on iTunes, search in the iTunes podcast directory for the Marketplace of Ideas, and bam, you're there. Send any questions, comments, feedback of any kind, guest suggestions especially, to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. It's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. Now, back to the conversation with Nathan Rabin on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. And there was another obscurity as well in the list that's not in the book, but that came up on the actual My Year of Flops feature on the AV Club, which was a movie that I myself had to spend some energy seeking out when it first came out on VHS, not on DVD for a while. It's free money. The movie, I was led to the movie because I was watching everything Thomas Hayden Church ever did for a little while, and that was a kind of a standard performance of his, but the movie itself, I've tried to describe it to people, never really successful. You, of course, did a lot better getting it across, but in a way, it's kind of an unconveyable movie, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. It came out in 1997, and in 1997, I was still working at a video store. That's where I met my colleague, Keith Phipps, who's now my boss, and I would write about direct-to-video stuff. And at that point, basically everything that was good had been released on video. So I just wrote about the stuff that like nobody watched and that nobody thought about. So when if I saw something that like starred Don the Dragon Wilson and Gary Busey and Richard Roundtree, I'm like, score! This is going to be the best video review ever. And yeah, I saw this poster, and it was Marlon Brando, Donald Sutherland, Mara Sorvino, Thomas Hayden Church, Martin Sheen, Charlie Sheen. Like, how did this movie get made, and how come I don't know anything about it? And then I sort of popped it in, and it's this really bizarre, sort of Smokey and the Bandit style, like wacky comedy with Marlon Brando, like a giant walrus mustache. Like this crazed, like Roscoe P. Coltrane figure who has like these daughters, and Thomas Hayden Church and Charlie Sheen like get together with them, and he accuses them of being like stinkball fornicators, and it's even by Marlon Brando standards, it's completely insane. And it also is this very weird sort of homage to Apocalypse Now. And it sort of brings together Martin Sheen and Marlon Brando under the least dignified possible circumstances. But it was one of those films where, and I think it actually was in the book for a while, I had to cut it out, where I write about them for an online audience, and a lot of comers are like, this movie doesn't exist. Like, I don't know how you can write about this film that doesn't exist. Like, you're just messing with us. But yeah, that was definitely one of those kinds of films. Another would be the movie Tiptoes, which did not make it into the book, but that's the comedy drama starring Gary Oldman as a dwarf.
Right.
Yeah. And it's supposed to be like this message movie about, the dignity of little people. And it completely undermines whatever sort of point it would make by casting, Gary Oldman in a role that obviously should have gone to an actual little person. And Peter Dinklage is his best friend in the movie. So it's not like they could find a really talented, charismatic little person actor. But yeah, I kind of take a certain perverse pride in singling out these movies that seem too preposterous to actually inhabit our world.
Now, when you're writing about the flops, how much of your task do you think is just describing what is wrong with the movies and making some funny jokes about that? And how much is trying to sort of dig down deep and get to the actual mechanics of the wrongness to find out why things went wrong, to find out why free money is so weird, for anything like that?
Right. Well, I think it varies film by film. There are definitely movies where I'm kind of piling on. Or, I find something that's so ripe for ridicule that I almost can't help myself. But then there are other things like, I guess my last one, Pretty Mean Fell in a Row, where I take that film seriously, where there aren't that many jokes in it, where it's more of just... That's another one where it's kind of hard to even imagine that the film exists. It's a 1971 black comedy written and produced by Gene Roddenberry, the man who created Star Trek. And it stars Rock Hudson as a charismatic football coach who sleeps with his students and then murders them. And the thing that's great about it is that it doesn't take a judgmental attitude towards that. It actually is, I think, the world's only ambiguously pro-serial killing high school black comedy. And with that, I kind of felt like the movie did a lot of the work for me. Like, the movie is so weird and so interesting that all I kind of have to do is do justice to it and come away with something that is really, really interesting. With some movies, they're just really, really dull. One that I felt like I had to write about was The Adventures of Pluto Nash. And I'd seen The Adventures of Pluto Nash, the Eddie Murphy sci-fi comedy from 2001. And I remembered it just being agonizingly dull. And I felt like I had to write about it because it cost something like $100 million and made $4 million. And the film itself isn't interesting, but I thought it was interesting in what it sort of said about Eddie Murphy and how he was such a spectacularly talented and charismatic and just had all the promise and potential in the world. And then after a certain point, he just stopped trying. It's like the light went out in his eyes, like something just went dead inside. To the point where, like, now, it is like a Bowfinger or, a Dreamgirls. Like, a lot of the praise that he receives is just like, wow, it's amazing to see Eddie Murphy actually engaged in what he's doing, that he's not just sleepwalking through another terrible film. But I kind of felt like The Adventures of Pluto Nash is kind of the, it epitomized this sort of sleepwalking that he does. There's this idea that we don't really know Eddie Murphy. He doesn't really give of himself in any of his performances. And that in itself is kind of sad. And you look at somebody like Richard Pryor or, Sam Kinison, those are very messy tragedies because they're people who are spectacularly talented and just completely imploded. Whereas I think with Eddie Murphy, it's a quiet tragedy because you have somebody who didn't become an alcoholic, who didn't become, a drug addict, who, by all means has like this very tidy, neat little personal life, but who stopped doing good work, almost deliberately so, and just doesn't feel the need to realize his potential on any conceivable level. So, yeah, sometimes it's the movie itself that are really interesting. Sometimes, I want every Meyer Flop case file to be about more than just the film I'm writing about. I, want it to be kind of the springboard to discussing something, the filmmaker behind it or the cultural time that it occupied or, something a little bigger.
I have to imagine, though, that you're at least somewhat grateful that the career of Eddie Murphy can and continues to provide you with flops to write about. Like, you could go to his well many times.
I could, but again, the fact that he doesn't try anymore, I think that makes it not that fun to write about. And the movies that are fun to write about are movies that have this incredibly misplaced conviction and this misplaced sense of confidence and this delusional belief that they're making a difference or commenting insightfully on the world or bringing great art and truth into the universe. Whereas I think the Meet Daves and the picture this, imagine that, whatever the hell, his latest insulting family comedy. I mean, that just basically says Eddie Murphy likes money.
No.
I think that'll be that'll be the name of my biography. Eddie Murphy likes money. The later films of Eddie Murphy.
I can't wait for that critical study. And what besides being bad can make a movie into a flop?
Well, I think a lot of times it's just sort of timing. Also, I think kind of Ishtar would be a good example, where Ishtar was, the first two films that are, the first three films that Elaine May wrote and directed. The first one was A New Leaf, and then The Heartbreak Kid and Mikey and Nicky. And they were both, I guess all three of them were kind of these sort of very small films that became sort of big. By virtue of Elaine May being sort of this perfectionist of like taking months and months, if not years, to edit down her films by changing them pretty radically. And then in the mid '80s, she was given a great deal of money to film Ishtar, and it was a really, really funny script, and I still think it's a very, very funny film. But that was kind of a big film that became just monstrously huge, and there was all sorts of bad buzz on it. And Elaine May is a bit of a paranoid individual, and for a while she said, I should like a talk at Walter Reed, and she said that for a while she thought that somebody within the actual government or the CIA was like undermining Ishtar because it, sort of secretly this sort of scathing satire of American foreign policy opportunism. And she actually realized, no, it was actually somebody within Sony who didn't like the movie that kind of undercut it. So with that, I felt like there was so much bad buzz. There's also the idea of this was supposed to be an extended riff on Hope Crosby road movies. And Hope Crosby road movies, delight in their cheapness and their artifice, and that they're obviously just wandering around a back lot, and they're not actually in, the Sahara or anything. So I think people thought it was really, really perverse to, get all David Lean and hire Vittorio Storaro as your cinematographer, so that you could do everything not just life-size, but bigger than life. So that was a film where I think I don't know that it ever would have been a big hit, but I think people would have been able to appreciate it a lot more if it was sort of a weird culty type film instead of being posited as here's a giant blockbuster starring two of the biggest movie stars in the world. I think another example of a film that's kind of didn't really occupy the place in the culture that it should have would be Scott Pilgrim versus the World, where that's Edgar Wright, who did Hot Fuzz, who did Shaun of the Dead, this very interesting, very talented, and sort of quirky indie style genre filmmaker. And this was supposed to be like kind of his bid for giant mainstream success. It had Michael Cera. It was based on this very acclaimed graphic novel series. And I think people thought that this was going to be, Paranormal Activity type thing. It was going to go from the underground to like this huge, huge blockbuster. And it didn't. It basically did what Edgar Wright's other movies did, because it wasn't meant for like an incredibly broad audience. The world would much rather accept, Criminy. I'm trying to think of who current action star is. Jason Statham.
Yes.
As an action hero as opposed to Michael Cera. But I think now, a mere 2 or 3 months after it kind of underperformed at the box office, it's already being embraced as this cult movie and as this sort of ahead of its time, sort of fusion of comic books and anime and video games and kind of everything that makes Gen Xers, cerebral cortexes light up like a Christmas tree. So yeah, I think sometimes films are just, they're victims of bad buzz, they're victims of bad timing, they're victims of bad marketing campaigns, they're victims of, the celebrities kind of bottoming out. So yeah, there are, 100 different reasons why a film can fail. And only about 75 of those are actually related to them being terrible.
And of course, the Ishtar qualifies in your book as a secret success, and I take it Scott Pilgrim would as well, in your mind, be a secret success?
Oh, definitely.
And it's very interesting to see what does surface as a secret success in your book, because you also have in there, you have maybe an unexpected entry, which is Steven Soderbergh's version of Solaris. And, even myself, I count the Tarkovsky version as one of my favorite movies, and Soderbergh also as a favorite filmmaker, but yet hearing that project announced, there was kind of a twinge that this isn't going to work out well for anybody, even if it's good. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's actually James Cameron was originally going to direct that, and I guess Steven Soderbergh stepped in at the last minute. That actually is an interesting one, and that one of the reasons why I wanted to write about it was because I have a lot of affection for it. I think it's a really, really good movie. I think it's in its own weird sort of way. It's very faithful to the source material and to the Tarkovsky film, but it also got a cinema score of F. Which means that, they ask people after they went to go see it, like, hey, what did you think of that movie? And I guess most movies do really, really well because, you go pay $12 to go see, I don't know, The Expendables. You have a pretty good sense that you know what it's going to be and that you're going to enjoy what it has to offer. But with Solaris, I think people thought, like, oh, this is going to be like this, exciting George Clooney sci-fi movie. And instead, this is incredibly sort of sad, moody sort of meditation on loss and remembrance and memory and the parts of our lives and our past that we can never recapture, no matter how hard we might like to. So I think that was part of it. Was the Egghead set. We're I think going to be a little wary and a little skeptical of Solaris because again, probably not that necessary of a remake of a great film. You have a big Hollywood movie star, and then people who want a sci-fi movie with lots of spectacle. Yeah, I think I'm going to be very bored by something where all the action is internal. It all kind of happens inside George Clooney's mind. It's not about space battles or Wookiees or things of that nature.
I do think, yes, Soderbergh's version of the movie was a good movie, but also doomed by lacking sort of a place in the culture to fit in. And for another example of this, I think of a movie that isn't a good movie in itself. Gus Van Sant's version of Psycho, his shot-for-shot remake, which he's remaking a good movie, not in a good way, but there was just this was a movie that had to be conceived without hope of success, right?
Well, I think with Gus Van Sant, I think he always kind of an art school kid. Right. I don't think he ever really went Hollywood. I think what happened was he accidentally kind of stumbled into directing a movie, Good Will Hunting, that was very, very successful and was successful beyond anybody's expectations. So I think after that, sort of Hollywood was whispering in his ear and saying, "You're the man now, dog." So he basically had this blank check to do whatever the hell he wanted. And I think he, sort of the art school prankster in him thought, well, wouldn't it be an interesting experiment to try to recreate this masterpiece using this template, this blueprint from a previous masterpiece? And the answer is like, no, like that won't work. But, I think he was, I don't think he necessarily had that in mind. I think it was just a matter of Psycho was a property that, was still a very going concern, that was still very lucrative, that, has a huge iconography behind it. And again, I think they kind of hoped for the best, that something great would come from this. And they took a huge chance, and they failed really spectacularly. And it's interesting to note that Vince Vaughn should be very, very grateful that the film was such a flop. Because, who on earth thinks of Vince Vaughn as Norman Bates? Whereas Anthony Perkins, one of the tragedies of his life, is that he could never stop being Norman Bates. And he was a great actor. He should have had a much more vibrant and impressive career than he did. But he just got typecast, as that weird, creepy dude. And yeah, he never really recovered from that.
I was fascinated to see Gus Van Sant, pop up in this project at least twice with Psycho and even Cowgirls Get the Blues, which we can discuss. But he's such kind of an infuriating figure to me because a lot of his latter-day movies like Paranoid Park or Elephant I've loved, but then he's got these weird mechanical paycheck projects like Finding Forrester, to which you alluded earlier, and then the stuff like Psycho, the shot-for-shot remake. And it's maybe he's just trying to mess with us to an extent, but I feel like every time I see a Finding Forrester or what have you come out from him, it's like, you could have made another Paranoid Park, but geez. Right.
Well, I think about with that is kind of he's doing sort of what Steven Soderbergh does, which is sort of one for me and then one for you. Like, I'm going to make a weird, low budget verite style movie about a prostitute starring a porn star,
right.
And then I'm going to do Ocean's 13. And yeah, I think with Gus Van Sant, it's kind of the same thing, where he's making these movies to satisfy himself and to kind of satisfy his muse, and then he also has to pay the bills. And I think, with something like Milk, it's hopefully kind of a joining of those two impulses, where it is a conventionally made film, and it is something that the mainstream can and did embrace, but it also kind of reflects who he is as a person and kind of what his preoccupations are. So I think, he's found a much better sort of medium than most filmmakers. And the fact that two of his films are in my book should in no way, shape, or form be considered, a slight against him in any sense.
And the inclusion of Even Cowgirls Get the Blues, and this is maybe personal to me, but that always stuck in my consciousness as sort of I'll use your word, a quintessential failed movie, because Roger Ebert gave it a very bad review when I was reading him, when I first got into reading criticism. And of course, he also, if we're talking about Ebert, famously he hated North, another movie you have to approach. And how much grounding in the sort of critical talk around one of these flops do you put yourself into before you write your own take?
It's just in terms of writing my own reviews, I try and make a point of not reading anything before me, because again, I don't want it to influence me one way or another. I don't want to subconsciously, borrow or paraphrase somebody else's idea. But when dealing with minor flops, I kind of want to get a sense of the critical consensus. So I kind of cheat sometimes. I'll go on Metacritic, I'll go on Rotten Tomatoes. As long as it's beneath a certain thing, then, it's kind of cool for cats. But I don't read that much film criticism these days, which I think is kind of odd. But I read my colleagues at the AV Club, I read Roger Ebert. But I guess for some reason, I kind of feel like you have to have faith in your own convictions, and you have to have faith in your own taste and judgment. And if you allow yourself to hear too many voices, sometimes that can be difficult to have.
Does it occasionally give you, if for example, you find a not very well liked movie and find yourself enjoying it getting too steeped in what people have said about it would make you maybe think, geez, am I wrong?
Yeah, well, again, you kind of have to have faith in yourself. For example, I gave a very positive review to a movie called Lottery Ticket earlier this year. And, that does not have, prestige qualities about it. It's a vehicle for the musician, Little Bow Wow. Although now he's known solely as Bow Wow.
Not so little anymore.
Name for him. And it's just this very sweet, crowd-pleasing, funny, sort of raucous comedy that has a sort of poignant sort of undertone. And that didn't get good reviews at all. People just, and I think in part because that's not the sort of movies that people praise. You have your Oscar movies, you have your prestige pictures, you have things based on inspiring true stories. People played by Hilary Swank and Morgan Freeman. And then you have stuff that's just kind of genre films. And I feel like those are very easy to dismiss, and those are very easy to ignore. But a really good genre film is an impressive achievement in and of itself. Think of another impressive little genre film from about a year ago called Next Day Air, where there's a sort of blaxploitation, dark comedy, crime thriller. Then again, you look at the commercial and you'd be like, oh boy, that film looks really generic and unpromising. But I enjoyed the film, and I have to write a review that, is true to my actual experience of it, and that is that I had a great time at Next Day Air and Lottery Ticket. Every once in a while I'll write a review, and I'll be sort of surprised to see that I'm not only in the minority, but I'm the only person in the minority. I guess one example of that would be Black Dahlia from a few years back, which I really liked. I thought it was problems, and it was, not wholly successful, but, I mounted a defense of it. And, God, that was just universally loathed. For months and months and months. Commentators would be like, I can never take anything you say seriously ever again because you like Black Dahlia. And I would just want to say, you kind of have to look at a gestalt of what somebody does. Not, I disagreed with you in this one instance, therefore I can never take what you do seriously or, feel it has any validity whatsoever.
There is one more one more film that I can't let this interview pass by without mentioning. I think it's too important in the world of flops to ignore, and that is Howard the Duck. Often talked about, not much seen before recent years, but often talked about as a totem to cinematic failure in every sense, in financial or artistic or even a technical sense. And that, since I watched it myself, it sort of took the place in my mind as an iconic, just a monument to lack of self-awareness. It strikes me as a film that just has no idea what it is and fails by that means. How does that line up with the way you think about its failure?
Well, I mean, I think that kind of a film that's very analogous to that would be 1941. And George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, God bless them, are geeks. They're movie geeks. They're if Hollywood were a high school, which it pretty much is already, they'd be in the AV club and they'd have pocket protectors and they'd get shoved into lockers and whatnot. And I think they kind of decided at a certain point, Steven Spielberg, I kind of want to get in with the National Lampoon crowd, and I want to be wacky and irreverent and young and in your face. And he made 1941, and it was this complete mismatch where that's not who you are, Steven Spielberg. You're not a smartass. You're not Robert Zemeckis. You're not Joe Dante. You're this guy who believes in things. And if you're going to try and be mean and funny, it's just not going to work. I think it was kind of the same thing for George Lucas, where Howard the Duck, which I haven't really read that much as a comic book, got really good reviews. It was supposed to be subversive. It was supposed to be edgy. It popped up in Pretenders songs and Stephen King novels. So it had cultural currency. And I think George Lucas got into his mind that he could both make an E.T. or a Gremlins. And at the same time, maybe be a little wackier, be a little more irreverent. It just failed spectacularly. I think part of it was he hired Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, who co-wrote American Graffiti with George Lucas. And that was their crowning moment of achievement, and they never accomplished anything after that. But he kept employing them, I think, in part, out of loyalty and out of, hey, you helped make my career, so I'm going to support you. And this was, they wrote and directed it. I don't think they really had a very good grasp on what was going on, and it kind of got bogged down in special effects, and it's a very, very confused Howard the Duck. And the intimations of bestiality didn't really help either.
And yet...
They seldom do.
And yet, after seeing the movie, despite everything wrong with it, and it is one of the wrongest movies I've seen on many levels, I couldn't help but feeling that the world would be a lot poorer a place without Howard the Duck.
I don't know there'd be a lot poorer place without Howard the Duck. I'd say it would be a slightly poorer place.
It'd be a smidgen
Although my
poorer.
favorite thing about Howard the Duck is apparently Tori Amos was at one point supposed to be the star of it. This is during her hair metal incarnation as the lead singer of Why Can't Tori Read, and that is can't with a K.
Yes.
But I guess when Leah Thompson became available, they're like, she's it. But imagine how much weirder Howard the Duck would have been if Tori Amos was the star of it.
Yes, our world is a poorer place not to have that Howard the Duck.
Yeah.
Now that I think
imagine
about it.
how different her career would have gone as well. It'd be something that she'd be running away from for decades and decades and decades.
The name of the book, once again, is My Year of Flops, One Man's Journey Deep into the Heart of Cinematic Failure. Nathan Rabin, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
If you'd like to learn more about Nathan Rabin, the AV Club, and My Year of Flops, visit avclub.com. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can listen to this show again or any other interview in the entire Marketplace of Ideas history at colinmarshallradio.com. That's colinmarshallradio.com, the official Marketplace of Ideas website. If you want to download it on iTunes, feel free. Go to the iTunes store, search for the Marketplace of Ideas. You'll find them all there as well. Questions, comments, feedback of whatever kind you want, or guest suggestions, send them along to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. It's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. And of course, the website of Ben Althouse, the man who makes our theme music, is available at benalthouse.com. As always, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand.